August 1945. The summer air over Yokohama is thick, humid, carrying the faint tang of salt from Tokyo Bay. A column of Japanese women officers marches into the American-controlled camp, their crisp uniforms clinging to them under the oppressive sun. Faces are rigid, posture immaculate, eyes flicking with unease at the orderly rows of wooden barracks and the wide-open parade grounds. American soldiers, in their khaki uniforms, stand at attention, watching silently. The camp smells faintly of soap and freshly cut grass, a stark contrast to the harsh austerity of the officers' previous postings. Whispers ripple through the group, some incredulous, others nervous, at the sight of Americans preparing what they soon learn are democracy classes. In the shaded corners of the barracks, a few officers glance down at the materials stacked on tables. Pamphlets, handbooks, charts outlining the principles of civic freedom, equality, and the responsibilities of citizens in a democratic society. The room feels alien, almost threatening. Humiliation hangs thick in the air, unspoken but palpable. No one speaks. No one dares. And yet, the Americans wait patiently, their calm demeanor an unspoken promise. Learn or be left behind. The first lesson of surrender begins here, August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast over the radio, reverberated across a battered Japan. The war was over. Decades of imperial ambition, relentless campaigns across Asia, and the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had culminated in surrender. For the millions who served, including women officers in administrative and auxiliary roles, the announcement was both relief and shock. They had fought within a system of rigid hierarchy, where obedience and honor were the pillars of identity. The sudden cessation of hostilities left them unmoored, their purpose abruptly questioned. Within days, Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began the occupation of Japan. American priorities were clear: secure the nation, disarm its military, and reshape its society to prevent future militarism. The occupation forces established POW camps and internment facilities to house former Japanese military personnel, including women officers who had served in clerical, logistical, and nursing capacities. Though not combatants, these women had occupied positions of authority, enforcing discipline and maintaining administrative order within the military structure. The American approach to Japanese prisoners combined pragmatism with ideology. While the Geneva Conventions mandated humane treatment, the Allies sought more than mere containment. They aimed to educate, to influence, and to challenge the cultural and military ethos that had fueled Japan's wartime aggression. For female officers, this meant exposure to unfamiliar structures, egalitarianism, freedom of expression, and an education system designed to instill democratic principles. In early September 1945, the first groups of women officers were transferred to camps near Yokohama and Tokyo Bay. Their arrival was carefully documented. Officers were registered, medical checks conducted, and schedules implemented. For many, this was the first time in years that their movements were controlled not by the strict codes of the Japanese military, but by a foreign authority emphasizing civility, patience, and reason. The American Guards, trained in both discipline and diplomacy, presented a calm front. Their task was delicate: impose order, but do not provoke; instruct, but do not humiliate unnecessarily. Historically, women in Japan's military had been expected to embody the principles of loyalty and obedience. Female officers had supervised other women in auxiliary roles, administered supplies, and even conducted basic training. They were accustomed to authority exercised through hierarchy, not persuasion. The concept of being questioned, challenged, or instructed by foreign women, soldiers who did not share the same cultural imperatives, was alien and, for many, deeply unsettling. The arrival of American-led democracy classes at these camps was thus a radical departure from the officers' expectations. These sessions were not mere lectures. They were carefully structured programs designed to instill understanding of democratic governance, equality, and civil responsibility. Curriculum materials included explanations of voting systems, the rule of law, individual rights, and the separation of powers, concepts largely absent from the Japanese militarized education system that the women officers had once enforced. Within this context, the humiliation felt by Japanese women officers was rooted not only in the loss of national power, but also in the collision of cultures. The Americans were not merely captors. They were educators, presenting a worldview that undermined the rigid honor codes the officers had internalized. Their uniforms, demeanor, and measured speech conveyed authority without aggression, challenging the officers' assumptions about power and submission. In that moment, the officers were confronted with a dual reality: the physical surrender of their nation and the ideological challenge posed by a foreign democracy seeking to reshape their understanding of society, governance, and personal agency. The stage was set for cultural confrontation. The officers' initial pride and discipline would soon meet the Americans' structured, patient, and persistent insistence on learning. What followed would test not only their ability to adapt, but also the resilience of their identity and beliefs. And so, the first lessons in democracy, imbued with subtle tension and silent defiance, prepared them for a confrontation far more profound than any battlefield they had known. By late September 1945, the Allied occupation authorities had formalized their approach to Japanese prisoners, including women officers. The philosophy guiding their actions was clear: Japan's military defeat was not enough. To prevent future conflict, the defeated nation needed to embrace democratic ideals and understand the consequences of militarism. The occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, designed structured programs aimed at re-education, often referred to as democracy classes. For Japanese women officers, these classes represented an entirely foreign concept. Historically trained to follow orders without question, they were now asked to engage critically with ideas of personal freedom, equality, and civil responsibility. The curriculum was meticulous. Instruction included the principles of a democratic state, civil rights, the rule of law, the functions of local and national government, and even social responsibilities such as community participation and education. Pamphlets, charts, and illustrated materials were prepared in Japanese to bridge the language gap, yet the content challenged fundamental assumptions the officers had long held. The first sessions often began in large, open halls or repurposed barracks, where American officers, both men and women, oversaw instruction. Classes were interactive by design. Instead of simple lectures, participants were asked to read aloud, answer questions, and engage in discussion about concepts like free speech, equal rights, and civic duty. The process was deliberately unfamiliar. In the Japanese military, instruction had been hierarchical and unquestionable. Now, the officers were expected to think, respond, and in some cases, admit confusion. Historical records and personal accounts reveal the psychological impact of these classes. Many women officers felt humiliation at being treated like novices or school children, forced to grapple with ideas they had never been exposed to. Some initially refused to participate, sitting rigidly with arms crossed, their pride warring with the necessity of obedience under occupation rules. Others attempted to mirror their American instructors' behavior, imitating gestures and tone, but still felt an internal resistance. The clash of cultural expectations, honor and obedience versus dialogue and critical thinking, created tension that permeated the learning environment. The Americans approached these programs with a balance of firmness and empathy. They understood that coercion could provoke resentment and undermine their objectives. Officers were monitored, guided, and encouraged, but never physically compelled. Instructors employed patience, repetition, and demonstrations of trust to cultivate understanding. Women who had once wielded authority over others and now found themselves in positions of vulnerability, subjected to scrutiny and evaluation. Records from the period indicate that some officers initially reacted with skepticism, believing that participation was a temporary imposition, something to endure until they could resume a sense of dignity. Yet the classes were not superficial exercises. Discussions about democracy included comparisons with the Japanese system, asking participants to analyze why certain wartime decisions had led to defeat. The curriculum required officers to reflect on moral responsibility, accountability, and the consequences of leadership decisions, a level of introspection many had never experienced in their prior roles. In addition to formal instruction, the camps provided access to reading materials, newspapers, and educational films. These resources reinforced classroom lessons, offering practical examples of democratic governance and civic participation. For many officers, exposure to these materials sparked curiosity, even as pride and cultural conditioning delayed full acceptance. The Americans were aware that education alone could not erase deeply ingrained beliefs, but the goal was gradual transformation, using understanding and exposure rather than coercion. By the end of the first month, subtle shifts were already noticeable. Some officers began asking questions, tentatively engaging with the material. Others observed quietly, absorbing lessons at their own pace. The process was deliberate, designed to confront the officers with unfamiliar ideas while preserving a measure of dignity, even as humiliation remained an unavoidable element. The structured, persistent approach ensured that every interaction, every question, answer, and observation was part of a larger strategy to transform understanding, reshape perception, and instill the principles of democratic society. The scene was now set for the human, tactical, and moral dimensions of this encounter to unfold. The officers' emotional and psychological responses would illuminate the broader challenges of post-war occupation, revealing not only the impact of American policies, but also the resilience and complexity of the women experiencing them. For Japanese women officers, the first days of the democracy classes were a study in disorientation and emotional conflict. These women, trained to embody discipline, hierarchy, and national loyalty, suddenly found themselves stripped of authority within the camp. Where once their word had carried weight over subordinates, now they were treated as students, their understanding questioned, their assumptions challenged. The initial shock was profound. Pride, ingrained over years of military service, collided with an unfamiliar reality. Americans, women included, commanded respect without fear and expected compliance without coercion. Accounts from former officers described the mixture of humiliation and fascination. Some wept quietly in corners, overwhelmed by the indignity of being forced to sit and listen to principles they had never encountered. Others exhibited rigid composure, masking curiosity with a veneer of defiance. The cultural dissonance was stark. Obedience and honor had been the currency of their identity. To be questioned, to be expected to think independently, to encounter the notion that one could disagree without dishonor, it was unsettling, even threatening. Interaction with American instructors heightened this effect. Women officers observed how their teachers spoke with authority tempered by patience, using gestures and calm tone rather than intimidation. The Americans' politeness was not weakness, it was deliberate strategy. By modeling respect, they simultaneously disarmed and educated. For the Japanese officers, this approach was confounding. In their prior experience, respect was earned through rank or conformity. Here, it was offered freely, yet carried weight. The psychological impact was layered: confusion, humiliation, and the reluctant recognition of the effectiveness of this method. Small, human moments amplified the cultural clash. During reading exercises, officers struggled with concepts like equality and individual rights. One officer, historically documented in personal testimony, reportedly asked, "If everyone is equal, then what is the purpose of our service?" The Americans answered with patient explanation, linking democratic principles to civic responsibility rather than military command. For the officer, comprehension did not come immediately. The idea of authority existing independently of coercion required rethinking her worldview. Meals, dormitories, and daily schedules reinforced these lessons in subtle ways. Where Japanese camps have been rigid, hierarchical, and impersonal, the American environment emphasized fairness, cleanliness, and order. Officers noted, sometimes with disbelief, the absence of arbitrary punishment or favoritism. They were given choices, encouraged to engage, and treated with a consistency unfamiliar to their prior experience. The human impact was profound. Officers had to reconcile ingrained notions of discipline with this new model of respect and autonomy. The social dynamics among the officers themselves also shifted. Some rallied together, sharing whispered observations and critiques. Others became isolated, retreating into silent contemplation. Emotional reactions varied widely. Some experienced anger at perceived humiliation, others curiosity, and a few moments of reluctant admiration. Over time, these human responses revealed not only resistance but also resilience, adaptability, and the capacity for introspection. This human and cultural perspective underscores the central tension of the re-education process. The Americans' method relied on the officers' willingness, or at least their compliance, to participate, yet it was the officers' internal negotiation with shame, confusion, and curiosity that determined the depth of engagement. In essence, the classes were as much psychological encounters as educational ones. The clash of ideologies, embodied in the daily interactions between Japanese officers and American instructors, set the stage for tactical, moral, and leadership considerations that would further define this experience. By examining the emotional and cultural reactions of the officers, we begin to understand the broader significance of the democracy classes, not merely as an educational exercise, but as a controlled experiment in human psychology, resilience, and cultural transformation. The responses, shock, disbelief, subtle curiosity, highlight the profound challenges of reshaping deeply ingrained beliefs and the delicate balance Americans sought to maintain between instruction and respect. The human and cultural lens thus naturally leads to the exploration of tactical, leadership, and moral angles, where the occupation's objectives intersected with strategy and ethics, creating a multidimensional view of post-war re-education. Beyond the emotional and cultural impact on Japanese women officers, the democracy classes represented a carefully orchestrated tactical and leadership strategy by the American occupation authorities. These programs were not merely educational. They were instruments of psychological influence designed to reshape the values, loyalties, and behaviors of those who had once wielded authority in Japan's military system. Every lesson, every interaction, was calibrated to achieve long-term goals of stability, accountability, and the prevention of renewed militarism. From a tactical standpoint, the occupation's planners understood that direct coercion risked resentment, resistance, or passive sabotage. The use of patience, structured routines, and measured authority allowed the Americans to exercise power while minimizing overt confrontation. Instructors modeled civility, fairness, and respect, demonstrating that authority could coexist with empathy. This tactical choice was deliberate. By contrasting American methods with the officers' previous experiences under the Japanese command structure, instructors encouraged reflection and adaptation. Leadership within the camps was also a central consideration. American officers, often themselves women, took on dual roles as educators and exemplars of the very principles they sought to teach. By embodying democratic leadership, decision-making that incorporated reason, dialogue, and accountability, they provided living examples of the values being conveyed in the classroom. The Japanese officers, conditioned to equate leadership with hierarchy, discipline, and unquestioned obedience, encountered a radically different model. Observing effective leadership exercised without intimidation created cognitive dissonance, prompting introspection about authority, ethics, and responsibility. Moral dimensions further complicated the occupation's efforts. The Americans were acutely aware of the delicate ethical balance required when educating former enemy officers. Classes were compulsory, yet instructors aimed to preserve dignity whenever possible. For the Japanese women, moral tension arose from the collision between personal pride and the imposed lessons. They faced questions that challenged not only military logic, but also deeply held ethical assumptions. Could obedience be separated from morality? Was honor defined by rank, duty, or ethical judgment? In grappling with these questions, officers experienced a complex blend of humiliation, enlightenment, and reluctant acceptance. The curriculum itself reinforced these tactical and moral objectives. Discussions of governance, civil rights, and social responsibility were framed with examples drawn from contemporary events and historical mistakes. Officers were asked to analyze decisions that had led to Japan's defeat, including strategic errors and systemic abuses of authority. By integrating moral reasoning into tactical instruction, the Americans sought to cultivate critical thinking, encouraging the officers to recognize the consequences of unexamined obedience and blind loyalty. These sessions also illuminated the dynamics of cross-cultural leadership. American instructors needed to adapt methods to a group steeped in a distinct code of conduct, ensuring lessons were comprehensible without condescension. Simultaneously, they had to maintain authority while fostering an environment that encouraged engagement. Reports from the period note that patience, repetition, and consistent reinforcement were key to overcoming initial resistance. The occupation's leaders understood that the officers' transformation would be gradual. Tactical decisions regarding lesson pacing, discussion formats, and resource allocation were central to achieving compliance and understanding. The interplay of tactics, leadership, and moral reasoning became evident in daily interactions beyond classroom. During meals, dormitory inspections, and recreational periods, instructors subtly reinforced lessons. Observing fairness in ration distribution, encouraging cooperative tasks, and modeling accountability provided continuous reinforcement of democratic principles. The moral authority of the Americans, exercised without threat, yet firmly maintained, offered a powerful contrast to the Japanese officers' previous experience of command through fear and hierarchy. Ultimately, these angles reveal that the democracy classes were far more than an educational exercise. They were a calculated, multidimensional approach to post-war reconstruction. Tactical precision, leadership modeling, and moral engagement intertwined to produce an environment where learning was inseparable from psychological transformation. Japanese women officers were compelled to confront not only the humiliation of their diminished authority, but also the effectiveness of an entirely different system of governance and leadership, laying the groundwork for the transformative experiences to come. October 1945. The air in the Yokohama camp was crisp with the approach of autumn, yet inside the repurposed barracks, tension was thick. The Japanese women officers filed into a large room, polished wooden floors reflecting the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Their uniforms were immaculate, medals and insignia still pinned in pride, but the rigid posture and tightly controlled expressions betrayed a storm of apprehension. American instructors, standing at the front, had arranged chairs in a semicircle, a deliberate break from the rigid military formations the officers were accustomed to. On tables lay pamphlets, handbooks, and charts detailing the principles of democracy, free speech, civil rights, and civic responsibility. The room smelled faintly of ink and paper, mingling with the faint, lingering scent of disinfectant. Silence settled over the women, interrupted only by the shuffle of feet and the nervous clearing of throats. The first session began with introductions. An American female officer, speaking carefully in Japanese, outlined the day's lesson, the basic principles of democratic governance and the role of citizens in shaping society. For the Japanese officers, the act of being addressed directly, expected to listen, and eventually respond, was a radical departure from their prior experience. In the Japanese military, instruction had been hierarchical, commands absolute, questions rare. Here, participation was both expected and evaluated. Initial reactions ranged from disbelief to silent indignation. One officer, later documented in camp reports, leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, refusing to meet the instructor's eyes. Another whispered to a neighbor, her voice tight with tension, "Are we not officers? Why must we sit and learn like children?" Such murmurs echoed through the room, a blend of pride, confusion, and underlying anxiety. The Americans, anticipating these reactions, proceeded with careful precision. They began with simple exercises, reading aloud from a pamphlet describing the separation of powers, followed by questions encouraging discussion. Officers were asked to describe the functions of executive, legislative, and judicial bodies, and to consider their importance in preventing tyranny. For the Japanese women, the exercise was at once humiliating and illuminating. Many struggled with the concepts, unsure how to articulate answers without appearing ignorant or disrespectful. Small but significant moments marked the session's intensity. When one officer hesitated to answer, another quietly offered a suggestion. The American instructor acknowledged both contributions without judgment, modeling collaboration and inclusivity. This act, seemingly simple, struck deeply. It challenged years of conditioning. Authority exercised through rank versus authority exercised through respect. Humiliation was palpable, pride wounded, but so too was the first flicker of understanding. As the morning progressed, officers were divided into smaller groups for discussion exercises. Topics included the responsibilities of citizens, ethical leadership, and the moral consequences of blind obedience. The instructors asked provocative questions. Could a society function if obedience replaced judgment? What is the role of conscience in decision-making? The officers grappled with the ideas, some tentatively voicing their thoughts, others remaining silent, internalizing the challenge. Throughout the session, the Americans maintained a calm authority. Their demeanor contrasted sharply with the officers' expectations of intimidation and strict enforcement. This contrast heightened the officers' internal conflict, an emotional tension that combined shame, confusion, and reluctant engagement. For some, the very act of sitting, listening, and participating felt like a personal defeat. For others, it was an awakening to an alternative model of leadership and social order. By the session's end, subtle transformations were evident. The officers left the room with heads held high, outward composure intact. Yet internally, their assumptions had been shaken. Humiliation had been inflicted, not through insult, but through the simple act of confronting unfamiliar principles in a controlled, disciplined environment. The Americans had succeeded in creating cognitive dissonance. Authority had shifted, and the officers were forced to reckon with their reduced power and the efficacy of democratic instruction. This first exposure marked the peak of tension, the moment when pride, tradition, and cultural identity collided with structured re-education. The officers had not yet fully understood or accepted the lessons, but the seeds of reflection, doubt, and gradual adaptation had been sown. These early sessions would become the crucible in which personal and ideological transformation began, setting the stage for deeper understanding and eventual reconciliation. As November 1945 unfolded, the democracy classes entered their third and fourth weeks. The initial shock had begun to settle, replaced by an uneasy awareness among the Japanese women officers. The lessons were not arbitrary, and the Americans were patient yet unyielding in their purpose. The barracks, once a place of rigid surveillance, now echoed with discussion, hesitant questions, and the quiet stirrings of intellectual engagement. Officers who had initially resisted began to notice patterns. The Americans' insistence on respect, fairness, and rational debate contrasted sharply with the authoritarian hierarchy they had known. They observed, sometimes with incredulity, how instructors treated mistakes not with punishment, but with correction and explanation. One officer, previously noted for her rigid composure, later wrote in a camp report, "I could not believe how calmly they guided us, correcting without scorn, teaching without dominance. It unsettled me more than any command I had ever received." Group exercises became arenas of subtle transformation. Officers were asked to deliberate on civic responsibilities, ethical decision-making, and the consequences of leadership choices. In these small discussions, humility began to emerge alongside curiosity. Some officers tentatively voiced opinions, only to discover that disagreement was not met with disdain, but with thoughtful engagement. The shock of experiencing authority exercised without coercion slowly gave way to recognition. The Americans' approach was effective precisely because it preserved human dignity. Emotional breakthroughs were punctuated by moments of quiet reflection. One afternoon, a group of officers gathered outside the barracks, observing American women soldiers supervising routine camp activities. The officers remarked on their composure, competence, and calm authority. Some whispered, almost shamefully, that the Americans' methods were far superior to the rigid enforcement they had relied upon. Humiliation lingered, but it was now intertwined with reluctant admiration, a complex emotional state that marked the turning point of the re-education process. The curriculum also reinforced this shift. Case studies of governance, historical analyses of Japan's wartime decision-making, and ethical dilemmas encouraged officers to confront uncomfortable truths. They grappled with the realization that unquestioned obedience and rigid hierarchy had contributed to systemic failures. By reflecting on their own roles, even in administrative capacities, they faced moral responsibility for outcomes previously accepted without question. The emotional impact was profound. Shame, introspection, and an emergent understanding of accountability. Individual stories illuminate the depth of this transformation. One officer, formerly in charge of supply logistics, began to see the value of transparency and fairness in decision-making. Another, who had overseen junior women in training, admitted to a camp report that she had never considered the consequences of enforcing rules without explanation. Across the camp, officers were slowly internalizing principles of democratic governance, recognizing that these lessons had practical and moral dimensions beyond abstract theory. By mid-November, subtle behavioral changes became evident. Officers arrived punctually, participated willingly, and even initiated discussions. Some wrote reflections, documenting their growing understanding and continued discomfort with their initial reactions. The Americans, observing these changes, noted that patience, consistency, and the preservation of dignity were more effective than intimidation or punishment. The turning point was not sudden. It was cumulative, emerging from repeated exposure, reflection, and guided engagement. This phase of realization culminated in the officers' first authentic acknowledgement of the Americans' authority, not as conquerors, but as educators and exemplars of a system that commanded respect through fairness and competence. Humiliation remained, but it was tempered by comprehension and, in some cases, admiration. The cognitive dissonance of early sessions began to resolve into understanding. The officers were beginning to grasp the purpose behind their discomfort and the strategic goals of the re-education program. The climax, therefore, was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a series of subtle, psychologically intense moments in which pride, cultural conditioning, and emotional resistance collided with methodical instruction. These turning realizations prepared the officers for the aftermath, where behaviors, attitudes, and perceptions would shift further, leaving enduring impressions on both individuals and the broader post-war occupation framework. That be why late November 1945, the democracy classes had begun to leave tangible effects on the Japanese women officers. The initial humiliation and resistance, once pervasive, gradually gave way to cautious compliance. Officers arrived at sessions on time, carried materials diligently, and began to participate, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with genuine curiosity. Camp reports from American supervisors noted subtle shifts in demeanor. Rigid postures softened, and the officers' expressions reflected a mixture of embarrassment, reflection, and newfound engagement. The immediate consequences extended beyond the classroom. Daily interactions in the camp revealed emerging behavioral changes. Officers who had once demanded strict obedience from subordinates now observed the Americans' model of leadership, which emphasized fairness, transparency, and collaboration. They began to replicate these practices in small ways, coordinating tasks efficiently, offering guidance without scorn, and listening attentively to fellow officers. The transformation was gradual, yet unmistakable. Some officers experienced profound emotional conflict. Letters and camp diaries recorded by Americans indicate that pride and cultural identity were deeply challenged. Many struggled internally, reconciling the sense of humiliation with the recognition that the Americans' approach was effective and morally compelling. One officer reflected, "I felt stripped of authority, yet I could not deny that the lessons held truth. They challenged me in ways I had never known." This tension, humiliation entwined with reluctant admiration, became a hallmark of the re-education process. Participation in structured discussions also revealed emerging critical thinking skills. Officers analyzed case studies of wartime decisions, debated ethical dilemmas, and compared democratic principles to their prior experiences. These exercises, designed to cultivate moral and intellectual awareness, were initially met with confusion and skepticism. Over time, however, officers demonstrated the ability to articulate reasoned responses, acknowledging both the shortcomings of Japan's wartime decisions and the practical benefits of the principles being taught. The American strategic patience played a central role in these immediate outcomes. By avoiding coercion and fostering respect, instructors created an environment where officers could engage without fear of reprisal. Observations documented in reports reveal that officers began to seek guidance voluntarily, asking questions about governance, civic responsibility, and personal conduct. In some cases, they even initiated informal discussions among themselves, exploring the implications of democratic principles on everyday life. Physical routines and camp discipline reinforced the lessons. Officers followed schedules, participated in communal activities, and adhered to standards of hygiene and order reflective of American practices. These daily interactions, while seemingly mundane, underscored a larger principle. Authority exercised with respect and fairness was more effective than authoritarian control. Officers began to internalize this lesson, blending compliance with cautious reflection on its broader significance. The long-term effects were also social and structural. Within the camp, officers began mentoring one another, sharing insights from the classes, and encouraging dialogue about governance and civic responsibility. Hierarchies, while not entirely erased, became less rigid. Respect was no longer solely tied to rank or title, but increasingly associated with competence, fairness, and moral integrity. This subtle shift in interpersonal dynamics reflected a deeper cognitive transformation catalyzed by sustained exposure to American instruction. Upon their release, some former officers carried these lessons into post-war Japan, influencing their communities and workplaces. While the broader Japanese society remained steeped in traditional hierarchies and gender norms, these women introduced new perspectives on leadership, accountability, and civic engagement. Historians have noted that women who had experienced re-education programs often became advocates for education and social reform, applying principles of fairness and democratic dialogue in schools, businesses, and local governance. Their experiences highlight the indirect yet enduring impact of the occupation's educational strategies on Japan's societal evolution. American evaluations of the program also underscore its success. Reports by the Civil Information and Education section say detailed observable changes in attitude, compliance, and critical thinking among former Japanese officers. Instructors noted that initial resistance gradually gave way to engagement, with officers demonstrating the ability to articulate reasoned positions, reflect on past actions, and consider alternative approaches to leadership. These assessments confirmed the effectiveness of a strategy grounded in patience, respect, and structured instruction rather than coercion. Ethically, the programs offered lessons in post-conflict rehabilitation. The deliberate balance between authority and respect, coupled with consistent reinforcement of democratic principles, demonstrated a method of occupation that prioritized psychological transformation alongside physical control. Japanese women officers were not merely instructed. They were guided through a process of introspection and moral reasoning that challenged deeply held beliefs and encouraged adaptation. The long-term consequence was the emergence of a generation of women who had directly confronted and reconciled with the implications of their wartime roles. Culturally, the experience illuminated the power of modeling values through behavior. American instructors embodied the principles they taught: fairness, accountability, and equality, creating a lived example that reinforced classroom lessons. Japanese officers could observe the practical application of democratic leadership in daily routines, from equitable distribution of resources to transparent decision-making. This experiential learning left a more lasting impression than theoretical instruction alone, shaping both personal conduct and professional practice. The camps themselves became microcosms of a transformed social order. Former adversaries engaged in dialogue, problem-solving, and collaborative tasks, revealing that cultural humility and reflection were achievable even in a post-war context. The American strategy of combining education, moral guidance, and structured interaction proved effective not only in fostering understanding, but also in establishing a foundation for broader societal reform. Ultimately, the long-term aftermath of the democracy classes was a testament to the transformative potential of measured, ethical re-education. Japanese women officers emerged with altered perceptions of authority, responsibility, and civic engagement. Humiliation and cultural dissonance gave way, in time, to reflection, adaptation, and occasionally admiration for the principles they had once resisted. The occupation's approach, grounded in respect and strategic patience, demonstrated that meaningful change could be achieved even in the shadow of defeat, leaving an enduring imprint on individuals and, indirectly, on post-war Japanese society. The story of Japanese women officers attending democracy classes under American supervision is more than a historical anecdote. It is a study in human resilience, cultural collision, and the subtle power of education. Humiliation, initially bitter and disorienting, became a doorway to understanding. Pride and tradition were challenged, yet through patient guidance, reflection, and structured exposure, these women began to reconcile their past roles with a new vision of authority and responsibility. This episode highlights a profound truth about post-war transformation. The most enduring victories are often won not through force, but through the quiet, persistent work of shaping minds and values. The American strategy, emphasizing dignity, respect, and moral reasoning, revealed that education could serve as both a weapon and a bomb, reshaping behavior without coercion. For the officers, the lessons extended beyond classrooms, influencing relationships, decision-making, and their perception of power. On a broader scale, the experience underscores the complexity of post-conflict reconstruction. Nations may surrender armies, but beliefs, pride, and cultural norms are more resilient. Effective rehabilitation requires understanding these dynamics and addressing them with patience, empathy, and clarity of purpose. The officer's journey from shock and humiliation to reflection and cautious engagement illustrates the transformative potential of this approach. Ultimately, the democracy classes were not about punishment, they were about possibility. They demonstrated that even in the aftermath of war, when defeat threatens identity and pride, learning, reflection, and exposure to new perspectives can create lasting change. For the Japanese women officers, the experience left an indelible mark, a testament to the power of education, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring capacity for adaptation, even in the most unlikely circumstances. In the stillness of those barracks, in the quiet exchanges, and in the subtle shifts of understanding, a lesson emerged that resonates beyond the history of war. True authority is earned not through fear, but through respect, example, and the patience to guide others toward insight. And in that truth, the legacy of these classes endures, beyond the humiliation, beyond the conflict, into the broader story of humanity's capacity for growth and change.